Hello and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. Each week I explore cases of murder and unfold the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Last episode I shared with you the many women who have mysteriously disappeared after becoming involved with a man named John Edward Robinson. This second part of the story will look closely at the investigation, his trial and appellate case, and explore the layers of the man behind the monster. When Suzette Trenton vanished and her mother received strange, uncharacteristic correspondence from her, Carolyn Trenton did her best to believe that her daughter was fine. After talking to John Edward Robinson, though, she felt less unsettled about the whereabouts of Suzette and decided that it was time to contact law enforcement. Miss Trenton reached out to the police to inform them that her daughter Suzette was missing. She insisted that they locate her two dogs, whom she would have never left behind. Police officers learned that the dogs had been reported as running around a trailer park, seemingly abandoned. Animal control had been called, and per normal protocol, they were taken to the local animal shelter. Fortunately, the dogs were adopted, and one of the main detectives on Robinson's case took a visit to one of the families. When he arrived, he called Pika's name, and the little Pekingese dog's ears perked up. His tail began to wag, and he ran right up to the detective. Law enforcement officers realized that they were no longer looking for the missing woman. They were now looking for a body. Once a task force was assembled to search for Suzette Trenton, which was 2 days after she was reported missing by her mother, and they had found her abandoned dogs, the police began to watch every action John Edward Robinson made. Carolyn Trenton and Detective Brown both believed that he was somehow involved in her daughter's disappearance. Detective Brown gave Suzette's mother a tape recorder and encouraged her to record a call to Robinson. This is the call recorded between Carolyn Trenton and her daughter's possible murderer, John Edward Robinson.
All I got was I got a little note, like a postcard thing, and saying that they were off on their adventure.
We haven't heard anything in a couple weeks, and I'm really getting nervous.
Oh, don't, I wouldn't get nervous.
I'm nervous. Susie always calls me, so...
Well, from what I understand, they're on a boat somewhere. It's kind of hard to call.
I am really getting very nervous about this. I don't know if I should maybe call the police or something.
Why?
Well, because I haven't heard from her, and that's not very juicy.
She's a big girl.
Wow. What an incredibly brave, strong, and determined woman Carolyn Trenton is. I can't even imagine how painful and difficult it must have been for her to behave as if everything was normal, talking to the man who likely killed her daughter. The inner power and patience she had to have to hold it together while recording him to help fuel this investigation is really astonishing and so admirable. On March 25, 2000, official jurisdiction for the case of missing person Suzette Trenton was handed over to the Lenexa police. They promptly established a task force comprised of officers from multiple jurisdictions to hone in on John Edward Robinson. On the 29th and 30th of March, Suzette Trenton's former room was searched, which didn't lead to anything of significant value, outside some small bloodstains. They executed everything from wiretaps and pen registers. For those of you who are not familiar with this investigative tool, it is a device that allows officers to trace outgoing signals from both phone calls and computers. The task force also conducted consent searches, surveillance, and trash hits, in addition to multiple search warrants. Law enforcement kept a very watchful eye on John Edward Robinson, as he continued to bring in women from all over the country, and even in other countries, and set them up in hotels. One of the investigators was in an adjoining room while he was with one of his lovers engaged in BDSM activity. There was one young woman in particular who Robinson was attempting to lure down to his farm property. And that is when police decided enough was enough. They were not going to take any chances of him harming another innocent woman. John Edward Robinson was initially held on charges of aggravated sexual battery of two women he had met online and enticed into town to visit him, and for the theft of the sex toys from one of the women, who was named Vicky Newfield. On June 3, 2000, around 1 p.m., law enforcement officers began their week-long search of Robinson's Kansas farm property. Once the police raided his farm, which was massive, at almost 17 acres, one of the investigators, Sergeant Roth, was informed that cadaver dogs had caught a scent. South of the woodshed, several yards to the southwest of the trailer on his property, sat two yellow metal barrels. They were out in the open near some trash bins. When Sergeant Roth began to roll one of the barrels out, it fell to the ground. The officers watched as a thin red line slid down the side of the barrel, and immediately a fly landed on it. That confirmed their worst fears. Inside the barrel was blood. When investigators pulled off the lid, they saw a body scrunched up inside. They believed it was the body of the missing woman, Suzette Trietton. Interested yet anxious and hesitant to open the second barrel, knowing that another corpse likely awaited to greet them, they peered inside it to find the body of who they believed to be Isabella Levitska. When the bodies were transported to the crime lab for analysis, the first body was believed to be Suzette Trietton's. The victim was nude, lying in the fetal position, and had a soft nylon rope placed around her head, with a piece of cloth covering her nose and mouth. The coroner determined she had been blindfolded, and it had fallen below the eyes. Dr. Pojman observed that she had two injuries. One that had torn her flesh near the left armpit, which appeared to have occurred post-mortem. The other was an oval-shaped mark on the left side of her skull, which the coroner believed had been a fatal blow. Although the body had only suffered minor decomposition, it was confirmed through dental records to be Suzette Trietton. Then the second body was examined. It was slightly more advanced in decomposition, and although like the first the body was lying in a fetal position, it was dressed in a short-sleeved nightshirt and partially covered up with a pillow. Within the barrel, there were 3 pieces of duct tape. The second victim had suffered from similar trauma to the skull, with this one having 2 injuries instead of 1. It was also confirmed through dental records that the second body was Isabella Levitska. Inside the trailer on his property, which John Edward Robinson had purchased and placed on the farm in 1998, were different kinds of trace evidence. Inside the sink laid a paper towel with a blood-colored stain on it. It contained 8 hair strands. Along the kitchen's wallboard and on the trim board were spatters of blood. The crime lab would later determine that the chances of the genetic profile of the blood on the towel, the wall, and the trim board being someone other than Suzette Trietton was 1 in 6 billion. Even though hair analysis cannot determine a positive identification of an individual, it can assist in eliminating people who don't share the same hair traits. However, the root of a hair does, and one of the samples matched the genetic profile of Suzette Trietton. There were also several boxes that contained personal items, confirmed by her mother Carolyn to be Suzette's. Inside a trash can in the south side bedroom, a roll of duct tape was found, which appeared to match the duct tape remnants located within the barrel that held Isabella Levitska. On this tape was a blood-colored stain, which was later confirmed to match the DNA profile of Levitska. On June 5, 2000, a search warrant would commence on Robinson's storage unit. 2 different units, the first one F10 in December of 1993 and the second one Unit E2 in January 1994, had been leased under the name Beverly Bonner. As the officers opened up the storage unit E2, they observed 3 barrels sitting at the back. The first one they opened was black with a gray lid. When they removed the lid, there was a body inside. The other 2 barrels were positioned in front of the one they had just opened. They were covered with a large plastic sheet, and the officers noticed that what appeared to be cat litter had been scattered around the outside. They could see that a dark fluid had penetrated the cat litter. When they lifted the sheet, the barrels had been pushed together. They were wrapped in plastic sheeting and secured with duct tape. 4 latent fingerprints were collected from the barrels. It was determined that 3 of them matched John Edward Robinson's, but the other one was unknown. Likely not wanting to witness yet another body inside, investigators elected to not open the other 2 barrels because their instincts told them that they held more victims. The investigation unearthed that there had been previous concerns raised as to the condition John Edward Robinson had left storage unit F10 when he transferred his belongings into the new unit. Apparently, the new tenant complained to management about a strange stain where it was believed a mattress had once laid. The manager of the storage facility even saw him once spraying some items down, but didn't think much of it at the time. The barrels were transported to the Jackson County Medical Examiner for autopsy and analysis of the remains. The victim's body was curled up inside the barrel and dressed in clothes appropriate for winter. Medical examiner Thomas Young determined that the victim had been inside the barrel for a long time. Her external features were indistinguishable, and so were the internal organs. There is no information as to what, if any, kind of liquid or something else that was placed within the barrels. I would presume that there had to have been something inside because the stench of dead bodies would have definitely caused alarm. And with this victim's features barely able to be distinguished, it sounds as if there was some kind of liquid inside that literally washed away her face. Like the other 2 victims, there was evidence of severe blunt force trauma to the head. A forensic odontologist later confirmed that the body was prison librarian Beverly Bonner. Then the first barrel of what appeared to be a set, considering how they had been purposely bound together, was examined. The body was that of an adult woman. She was also fully dressed. Although no precise date was determined, it was estimated based on the degree of decomposition that the victim had been killed 5 to 6 years prior. Consistent with the other 3 victims, the body had evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. On this body, there was something slightly different. This victim had fought her assailant, and in the process, had fractured her right forearm. The forensic odontologist would confirm that the body was that of Sheila Faith. Last examined was the barrel, which contained a younger victim. Believed to be in her teens, the girl was fully clothed and was wearing an adult disposable diaper. The state of decomposition matched the previous victims, and the body was estimated to be inside the barrel somewhere between 5 to 6 years. The young female had been struck at least 3 times with a blunt, rounded object, consistent with a hammer. It was later confirmed to be Sheila Faith's disabled teenage daughter, Debbie. During law enforcement's search of Robinson's 17-acre farm property in Lynn County, Kansas, investigators collected 9 hammers, 2 picks, and 1 chisel. Forensic analysts looked at every tiny imaginable crevice and marking on the tools, hoping and expecting to some extent to find evidence of tissue or blood, but nothing was ever concluded. Why in the world would you need so many hammers in one location, especially considering Robinson was not a laborer or a craftsman? Anyway, they were confident, based on the autopsies conducted, that all of the women had been killed by blunt force trauma consistent with the use of a hammer. Unfortunately, crime lab technicians were not able to determine which ones were used to murder the women. While the autopsies were being performed and analyzed, law enforcement had received consent from Robinson's newest paramour, Barbara Sander, to search her residence. Inside, they found many items known to have belonged to Isabella Levitska. One of the more pertinent pieces to the investigation, and thus the trial, was a set of bedding that had the same pattern which was on the pillowcase found inside the barrel with Isabella Levitska's body. It was also the same pattern of bedding in which she laid upon nude, posing for John Robinson, captured in photographs that were collected inside his storage unit. There were also oil paintings and pencil drawings that hung along the walls. Her friends confirmed these to be Isabella's artwork. The investigation would uncover that only months after he had set up a private mailbox for Beverly Bonner, John Edward Robinson had set up another one in the name of Sheila and Debbie Faith. He would go to the mailbox at least once a month to pick up Social Security benefits that were mailed to the mother and daughter. It was recorded that from July 1994 through September 1995, these checks were deposited into the business account of Hydro Grow Incorporated. But these checks stopped when the bank informed James Turner, aka John Edward Robinson, that Social Security checks cannot be deposited into someone's business account. After that, he took the check to other financial institutions and deposited them into his specialty publications account. In order to make sure he still received their ongoing Social Security benefits, John Robinson even forged a disability review form from the SSA. In August 1994, the SSA received a form signed by Sheila Faith with a medical report by Dr. William Bonner. It was later determined that the total benefits Robinson stole from this mother and her disabled daughter were around $97,000. For someone who believed that they were so much smarter than everyone else, John Robinson wasn't intelligent enough to dispose of an endless incriminating paper trail, various forms of his victims' identification, and keepsakes of his victims. He also held onto some of their personal belongings, which were most likely his trophies, some of which he kept himself, others he gifted to his other lovers. During the search of his mobile home, officers found 5 different computers on which he used his different aliases. They discovered a Home Depot credit card with the name James A. Turner, 1099 statements for Sheila and Debbie Faith, receipts from the Roadway Inn with Lisa Stasi's name on them, an IRS document allegedly signed by Beverly J. Bonner, and documents which identified both his real name and his alias, James Turner, as being affiliated with Equity Financial Group and Hydro Grow Incorporated. It almost makes you wonder if he believed to some extent that James Turner and his other aliases existed. He had spent so much time and energy crafting and manifesting this other side of himself that maybe to some degree he saw himself as 2 people, or maybe more. John Robinson's storage unit also unveiled 2 particularly fitting books for this kind of criminal inside his office. One was called The Heavy Duty New Identity, and the second was titled New ID, How to Create a Foolproof New Identity. I mean, how much more obvious could it be that John Edward Robinson had spent endless hours determining how best to create new identities for himself and figuring out exactly how to balance them without anyone being the wiser. Inside his storage unit, investigators discovered personal items of Suzette Trenton's, such as her Michigan driver's license, her birth certificate, Social Security card, and her high school diploma, amongst other documents and cards that clearly had been her property. John Edward Robinson also kept items that symbolized who she was as a person, like pieces of her jewelry, different collectibles, her nursing textbook, and her journal. Within these findings, evidence of their sexual relationship was found, including a sex tape, nude photographs of her, and the slave contract he had made her sign. As for Isabella Levitska, Robinson had held onto similar items, like her Polish passport, her Kansas driver's license, her Olathe public library card, and most importantly, there was a document which appointed Robinson as her power of attorney. The bag of expensive sex toys that he had stolen from Vicky Newfield laid amidst the mounds of circumstantial evidence linking him to the disappearances and deaths of so many women. When the warrant was issued on the storage unit in Olathe, investigators found the list that Suzette's aunt, Chadester, had helped her put together before she left for Kansas. They also found a plastic folder with 42 envelopes that had been pre-addressed to different members of Suzette's family, and 31 pieces of stationery in different pastel colors, all with "Love You, Suzette" as the closing signature. Inside a Target sack, they located more than a dozen envelopes, also in pastel colors, with greeting cards that were pre-addressed with S. Truetten as the return address, and the name of the person's birthday under which a stamp was then placed over. Many other letters were also discovered with greetings like "Hi, Dad" or "Hi, Mom" written at the top of the stationery. I mean, what kind of sociopath goes to these great lengths to continue communicating with their victims' loved ones? I can't help but wonder if it was not just his way of concealing her disappearance and the fact that he murdered her, but that he also received a great deal of pleasure from messing with her family's heads. Also, I just don't understand why her loved ones accepted these letters from the very beginning when it was not the way she communicated with them. Ultimately, this would be John Edward Robinson's downfall, because he was such an arrogant narcissist that he believed he could continue to convince them that this correspondence was from someone whom they knew and loved, which he never did. It always amazes me that there are perpetrators who attempt to cover up their crimes by pretending to be their victims, by writing texts, letters, and even leaving voice messages. I can't imagine how much anger I would feel if the person who murdered my loved one attempted to carry on as if nothing happened to them by sending me vague, generic communications, as if I wouldn't realize that whoever was communicating with me was not that person. What is more insane and heartbreaking is how many offenders get away with doing this. And the loved ones of the victim don't question what is going on sooner, if at all. This is not to place any blame on anyone other than John Edward Robinson, but I just find it such a tragedy that if they had asked more questions and looked into where their loved ones actually were, maybe, just maybe, some of these lives could have been saved. Then again, who would think that anyone could be so calculated and freakishly organized to concoct this level of correspondence to the families of his victims? I just don't believe that if I were in their shoes, so to speak, and my loved one met some man online, relocated to where he was, had been promised opportunities and a lifestyle way too good to be real, and then they just poof, suddenly they're traveling and insist on only sending me letters or email, that I would be taking their claiming to be fine at face value. There are just way too many red flags to simply ignore. You may be wondering, how do letters get postmarked and sent from different parts of the world to the victim's loved ones? The investigation would later reveal that John Edward Robinson had requested that a former employee of his wife's, a woman by the name of Jean Glines, mail a handful of letters on his behalf from her residence in California in late March 2000. She and Robinson had kept in touch after she had relocated to California in 1997, and apparently had told Jean that he and Nancy had gotten a divorce. John Robinson and Jean carried on a long-distance relationship for a while, until he kept bugging her about leaving California to move back to Kansas with him. Jean Glines loved her kids and her grandchild more than anything, and John Edward Robinson hated not being the center of her world. She was fed up with his nonsense and didn't want to hear from him anymore. He asked her for a favor, to mail out these letters from her place in California, which Jean agreed to if he just would leave her alone. When she received the package of 3 pastel-toned envelopes, she observed how some of them were written out to someone living in Michigan, and that there was no return mailing address. The names Suzette, Sue, or even just the initials ST were used. She found it all bizarre, but nevertheless, she honored her and John's agreement and mailed them from Milpitas, California, which is a location where all mail sent to and from has been postmarked with San Jose. It was also later discovered that Jean Glines was not the only person whom John Edward Robinson had tasked to help him with his concealment of murder, unbeknownst to them, of course. Carlos Ibarra, the same guy who worked in maintenance at the Santa Barbara estates, who later shared with law enforcement how John Robinson had bragged to him about his BDSM affairs, complete with sharing personal pornographic photos with him, also helped him out in this charade. When his mother, Lydia Ponce, visited from Mexico in early May, John Robinson asked Carlos if he would ask his mother for him to mail out some letters from a resort back in Mexico once she returned. When Lydia Ponce arrived in Mexico around May 10th, 2000, she did just that. She wrote the initials ST in the left-hand corner as directed and mailed these random, pastel-toned envelopes from a hotel in Veracruz, Mexico. There is no record as to if John Robinson paid Carlos Ibarra or his mother for doing this, but either way, I wonder why they didn't find this request strange or suspicious at the time, or did they just not care enough to ask? It seems to me as if John Robinson was not the only person to blame in this very calculated, freakishly organized plan to prolong this ruse that these women were alive and fine. Perhaps he would have been caught much sooner if these other people had not been willing to participate in something that, at least in my eyes, was blatantly shady. This career con man wasn't smart enough, though, to realize that his licking the envelopes would establish a DNA profile based on amylase, which is an enzyme made through the salivary glands, to match 8 of the 9 letters later found in the search warrant sent to Beverly Bonner's brother, Larry Heath. Although only initially charged with aggravated sexual battery and theft, prosecutors soon had an abundance of circumstantial evidence to extend these charges to multiple murder. On June 13, 2000, John Edward Robinson would be charged with 2 counts of capital murder, 1 count of first-degree murder for the intentional, premeditated killing of Suzette Marie Trietton, and the same charges for the death of Isabella Levitska. These 2 murders were both elements of the same course of conduct that led to the intentional, premeditated murders of Lisa Stasi, Sheila and Debbie Faith, and Beverly J. Bonner. In addition to these charges, he was also faced with aggravated kidnapping of Suzette Trietton, first-degree premeditated murder of Lisa Stasi, aggravated interference with Lisa Stasi's parental custody when he stole and sold her daughter Tiffany, and for theft of Vicki Newfield's property, specifically her sex toys, which John Robinson had refused to return. The prosecutor's evidence against John Edward Robinson would end up consisting of more than 23,000 pages of police reports and over 100 witnesses. During the trial, the following sequence of events were witnessed to have unfolded after Suzette Trietton went missing. Records would show that at 11:43 a.m., a long-distance call was made to Nancy Robinson's work number from John Robinson's trailer in Lynn County, Kansas. John Robinson was noted to have been in a rushed and agitated state when he picked up Suzette Trietton's dogs at 2:13 p.m. that same day. He tried to explain to the staff there that he was in a hurry to arrive at the airport. It was noted that Suzette was not with him inside the animal clinic, nor was she seen by anyone inside his truck, waiting outside. Less than 10 minutes later, the access code to the gates of his storage unit in Olathe were used, and within 6 minutes later, it was used again to leave. At 2:35 p.m., animal control officers were dispatched to Santa Barbara Estates. It was reported by the office assistant that John Robinson had told them to call animal control for 2 dogs seen running around the property. When Officer McLean arrived at the estate, there were 2 Pekingese dogs kenneled outside the office. He took them away to the local shelter. By 3 p.m. that day, it was recorded by a housekeeper at the guest house suites that someone matching the general appearance of John Robinson was loading up the possessions from room 216, which had been Suzette Trietton's room, into a truck whose description matched John Robinson's vehicle. Once she claimed room 216, the housekeeper discovered multiple towels and bed linens that had spots of blood. She was not particularly alarmed by this, since she had cleaned up similar blood stains from that room while Suzette stayed there. Suzette at the time had conveyed to the housekeeper that her menstrual cycle was abnormal and she often bled very heavily, therefore explaining the blood stains. It is not known if this was true or if perhaps the blood was indicative of rough BDSM play. This is purely speculation on my part, but I wonder why she felt the need to explain to the housekeeper. It's as if she wanted to cover it all up to prevent anyone from inquiring further. Anyway, about a half hour after loading up all of her belongings inside his truck, John Robinson was seen on the security camera checking out of room 216 and paying the final bill. Suzette Trietton was not seen anywhere on the hotel grounds. There are no known circumstances surrounding the mysterious vanishings of the other women, some of whose bodies were later found, and others who never were. Nancy Robinson, his wife of almost 40 years, sat in front of the court testifying as to the strong, good character of her husband. She spoke of what a great husband, father, and grandfather John Edward Robinson was, and that no matter what the outcome, she, along with many of their family members, would visit him regularly in prison. When Nancy Robinson was cross-examined by the prosecution, the court was stunned when the state asked, and I quote, "Would it affect your opinion of your husband if you knew that he had taken her to liaisons with one of his BDSM girlfriends?" Defense counsel immediately objected, and a bench conference was held. The state prosecution had a witness who would testify to the fact that John Robinson had brought his infant granddaughter with him on more than one of his BDSM escapades. I mean, how beyond perverse and disgusting. Yet Nancy Robinson continued to defend her husband's character, trying to justify or condone his actions in whatever way she could. Now, although there was zero proof that John Edward Robinson had an accomplice, part of me can't help but think that his wife Nancy was a participant in the concealment of his crimes. First, there was her jealousy of her husband's relationship with Isabella Levitska. Isn't it hypothetically possible that she gave John Robinson an ultimatum, or even blackmailed him with knowledge of his other crimes, to convince him to get rid of her? I am not suggesting that he cared about Isabella at all, because I don't think he is capable of having any real emotional connections. But what is known? He was definitely into her, and it appears that he was more involved with her on more than one level than he was with the other women he had affairs with. Then there is the matter of him covering Isabella up inside the barrel, keeping her in her nightgown and even with a pillow inside. To me, in his own twisted way, it seems like he didn't want to further degrade her by stuffing her inside the barrel nude, like he did with Suzette. I am just theorizing, but I find this detail to be interesting. There is also the unknown fingerprint found on the barrel inside the storage unit. What I find to be the most troubling evidence of all that could be used to support this theory is the mysterious call that was made by Lisa Stasi to her sister-in-law Kathy on her last snow night alive. Lisa specifically said, and I quote, "They want me to sign these papers and that they were coming. This is a clear indication that it was not only John Edward Robinson who was there with Lisa the night she disappeared. There was clearly someone else there with him the night Lisa Stassi's baby was taken from her. It is not unreasonable to believe that this person also was an accomplice in her death and the disposal of her body. The question of whether or not Nancy Robinson knew about her husband's heinous crimes was never determined. Her excuses and reasoning sounded like she was either a victim herself or perhaps she was part of the game all along. She admitted during his murder trial that she knew about her husband's alias, James Turner. Nancy said she believed it was the only way for him to do covert research to obtain the right statistics for his mobile home magazine. She justified this by saying that the community was very small and in order to find out anything of value for his research, he needed to portray himself as someone different. Nancy also admitted to having visited both the Kansas farm property where the 2 barrels were discovered, in addition to the storage unit where the other 3 barrels were found. She acted as if she had no clue as to anything malicious her husband was ever involved in. Nancy claimed to have absolutely no knowledge of anything involving the women found in the barrels. She acknowledged that her husband had a desire for what she called sadistic sex, and she was well aware of his countless affairs. They had been married for 38 years, so it is very difficult, if not impossible, to believe that she was so blind to what he was engaged in, much less that she didn't participate, or at the minimum, benefited from his crimes financially. John Robinson's defense counsel attempted to plant a seed of doubt in the jury's mind on whether or not he was the sole offender. They pointed out the extreme weight of the barrels, the unidentified fingerprint on the plastic sheeting around the barrels, and those on the roll of duct tape with Isabella Levitska's blood. All of these implications did not sway the jury. Were these slightly strange circumstances? Yes, but even hypothetically, if John Robinson had had an accomplice, none of that would mitigate his malicious and intentional premeditated murders and their carefully calculated cover-ups. There was never any evidence or logical reason to believe that someone other than him and his many aliases were involved in these crimes. On November 2nd, 2002, the jury returned within 1 day with a guilty verdict and a unanimous recommendation to the judge for a sentence of death for 2 counts of capital murder. The court imposed this sentence for counts 2 and 3 on January 21st, 2003. In addition, John Edward Robinson was given the following: 246 months for count 1, the aggravated kidnapping of Suzette Marie Trenton, 7 months for count 5, the theft of Vicki Newfield's adult toys, a life sentence with possibility of parole after 15 years for count 5, the first-degree murder of Lisa Stassi, 5 to 20 years pre-guideline sentence or 13 months post-guideline sentence on count 6, the aggravated interference of parental custody. The court also ordered him to pay restitution to his victims in the amount of $9,122.24. I get that he was a con man and he wasn't exactly wealthy, but shouldn't he at the very least have lost his 16-acre farm property? Anyway, as I have discussed before, restitution is more symbolic than anything else, and most of the time, the money is never seen by the victims or their loved ones. The cold case of Catherine Clampett was reopened in 2000 following John Edward Robinson's charges for multiple murders. He remains to this day the primary suspect. When John Edward Robinson was charged for the disappearance and murder of Lisa Stassi, his brother and sister-in-law began to have some suspicions as to the legitimacy of the adoption he had arranged. The couple had lovingly raised little Tiffany, who was renamed Heather Tiffany Robinson, as their own for the last 15 years. They were shocked and horrified to think that the atrocious crimes John Robinson had committed could lead them to losing their daughter. From all accounts and records, Heather's family was close, kind, and loving. Although she had been told she was adopted as an infant, she never imagined that the truth of her biological mother's death would be so grim and so close to home. In an exclusive interview with 2020 and 2019, Heather shared how she always felt uncomfortable in her Uncle John's presence. He was weird, creepy, and made inappropriate comments and gestures toward her. According to Heather, shortly before John Robinson was arrested, they were both attending a wedding in Florida. She recalled how he danced way too close to her and that he even asked her questions of a sexual nature. Heather now believes that she narrowly escaped the same fate of her mother. Apparently, John Robinson had encouraged Heather to come see him in Kansas. He said he would fly her out from Chicago, but that she didn't need to tell anyone. It could be their secret. His twisted games knew no limits, and he wanted to have sex with and possibly murder the woman's child he had stolen 15 years prior. I am not someone who is a proponent of the death penalty for reasons I dare not get into it, or at least this episode, but this type of offender and his beyond calculated game of life and death, which he inflicted upon his victims and their loved ones, the true number of which we may never know, makes me reconsider my position on the penalty. John Edward Robinson's appellate claims over the years were very many and mirrored similar complaints to other brutal murderers, like being denied the request for a change of venue. There was one complaint that stood out to me, and that was the excessive and biased amount of media interference, which could have led to actual prejudice against the defendant. The portrayals of the defendant as being guilty is common fodder in the media, but some reached new extremes. Apparently, during his trial, there was a local radio station that was handing out t-shirts that read, "Roll out the barrels of evidence." He claimed this to be extremely prejudicial to his case, which encouraged his third motion for a change of venue, all which the judge denied. It is hard to believe that this wouldn't potentially impact the jury, and if nothing else, I personally find this kind of publicity stunt to be tasteless and disrespectful to the victims and their loved ones. Everyone deserves to have their circumstances in life be known and heard. It doesn't condone, justify, and it may not even explain a person's actions, but may help society understand how certain traumas and abuse can trigger some individuals to behave in unthinkably dark and horribly violent ways. However, what was revealed in the courtroom during his murder trial seems like it was just another con to me from a man who was hell-bent on living his life as a fraud. I have a difficult time believing that childhood abuse and trauma triggers someone to become a narcissistic con man who holds zero value for human life. It was told by John Robinson's mitigating investigator Narad that the defendant had suffered chronic and even life-threatening violence, abandonment, and neglect at the hands of his parents, in particular his mother. He claimed that as young as 5 years old, his mother beat him and threatened to kill him multiple times a week, even though he had done nothing to warrant the abuse. John Edward Robinson allegedly was very close to his baby brother, whose sudden death his mother blamed him for. As he grew up, the abuse only worsened, and sometimes it was so horrific that he had to remain in bed and at times was left unconscious. It was believed by investigator Narad that his alleged abuse may have led John Robinson to suffer from PTSD, She believed he had the disorder based on his many symptoms, including dissociation, psychosis, extreme moods, flat affect, and bouts of mania. She, however, did not provide what qualifications, if any, she had to make such a diagnosis. It was stated in the records that this investigation was preliminary, and in order to offer a thorough and accurate background and social history report for the defendant, she needed ample time, which she could not complete in time for a trial that was set to begin that September. This continuance was denied. Surprisingly and understandably, much to the disappointment and anger of some of his victims' loved ones, John Robinson would be successful at some of his most critical of claims, which would result in more than one reversal of conviction. The defendant was convicted of capital murder in Count 2 for Suzette Marie Truetten and in Count 3 for Isabella Levitska. These counts were identical and were defined as, and I quote, one of multiple acts or transactions constituting parts of a common scheme or course of conduct in which other human beings were killed in a premeditated and intentional manner, to wit, Beverly J. Bonner, Sheila Faith, Debbie Faith, and Lisa Stasi. During his trial, the jury found him guilty on both counts and recommended a sentence of death for each count. However, John Edward Robinson in his appellate case claimed that these first-degree murder convictions were multiplicitous and thus could be considered unconstitutional, as they may violate the Double Jeopardy Clause. The appellate court decided that based on a prior decision, which held that multiple capital murder convictions based on the same murder of the same victims are determined to be multiplicitous, John Robinson's conviction on Count 3 would be reversed and vacated. Count 3 was reversed and vacated simply because it was the second capital murder charge and therefore constituted a violation of double jeopardy. So what does this mean for John Edward Robinson and, more importantly, his victims? The court stressed that in no manner does their decision minimize John Robinson's killing of Isabella Levitska or make his actions any less atrocious. However, since her murder was not included in Count 2, nor did it acknowledge the possibility of a different course of conduct within Count 3, the court agreed that Count 3 was in violation. There was also the matter of Lisa Stasi's murder, which John Robinson was convicted on under Count 5, and also sentenced to death for her murder, which was alleged as one of the victims under Count 2 and Count 3 as part of his common scheme or course of conduct. It was also determined by the court that based on a prior case decision, convictions arising out of a double homicide, one for capital murder based on the intentional and premeditated killing of more than one person, and the other for premeditated first-degree murder, is deemed to be improperly multiplicitous. Why is this considered multiplicitous? Well, if the capital murder was proven, then first-degree premeditated murder was also proven under this conviction, then the same crime cannot be prosecuted multiple times unless authorized as such. So the conviction of Lisa Stasi's murder under Count 5 was also reversed and vacated. John Edward Robinson attempted to appeal his case as recently as 2022 to have his death penalty sentence thrown out. But as of this recording, he remains on death row in Kansas. Now, I know hearing about these reversals of conviction is infuriating to hear, and it would be easy to place the blame on the courts, but the people who deserve the most anger are the prosecutors for overlooking what I consider would be a problematic structure of counts. Why did they not perceive how multiple counts that included the same victims without any deviation from the course of conduct could end up being considered, or at least teetering on the edge of double jeopardy? I do not have a degree in law, but I have taken several criminal law courses for my degree in criminal justice and criminology, and I am very passionate about the study of law. So this seems like a gross oversight to me on the part of the prosecutors. They really should have known better. For those of you who are not familiar with this legal term, the double jeopardy clause is part of our Fifth Amendment right, which protects us from being prosecuted more than once for what is substantially the same crime. The only exception to this rule is if the crime was committed across multiple jurisdictions or multiple states, if it's considered both a federal crime and a state level, and of course, the military tribunal. If you're interested about learning more about this and how it is handled in the criminal law, and you haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, please listen to episode 4, the Timothy Hennessy case. It is a fascinating one. For many of the worst offenders, I address the factors and elements of their life, which may have helped to create the monster that is one day released upon our society. It is critical to understand their environment and life experiences, to know what may have triggered their psychopathy and what can potentially be done to prevent such violence. However, in this case, the little that is known and that was used in an attempt to illustrate the mitigating circumstances around John Edward Robinson's life by his defense team appear to me to simply be another part of his game. The greatest deception would be for him to fool the criminal justice system as to who he really is, and somehow lessen the severity of his punishment. He was not a victim. He enjoyed nothing more in life than targeting and hunting vulnerable women who wanted to believe in something good. Someone who would care for them and offer them a better life, only to end up murdering them and covering up their disappearances in the most concocted and vile of schemes. John Edward Robinson was beyond a con man. He was beyond a predator. This man went to depths that are unmatched by many serial killers' modus operandi. This man lured in his victims, manipulated and exploited them in financial, sexual, psychological, and other perverse manners. When he was done with them, meaning when they had outlasted his use for them, he murdered them and disposed of them like their existence meant nothing. This was not the end of his terror, as this predator continued to weave an elaborate web of deceit and confusion around his victims' loved ones, in the hopes of successfully covering up his crimes for years after he killed them. Although John Edward Robinson is often associated with the moniker the internet's first serial killer, I don't find this to be an accurate name for him, since it is believed that he began manipulating, deceiving, and killing innocent women as early as the mid-1980s, if not earlier. Once the internet launched on a mass scale, he utilized its accessibility to go into internet chat rooms and find and lure in his ideal victims. Similar to the trappings of human traffickers, he would use a fake persona and sometimes a different name to appeal to his target victim, who were predominantly young and vulnerable women with an interest in the BDSM lifestyle. John Robinson would portray himself as a single, successful businessman who was looking for a woman to explore his sexual fetish with. Often, it also came with the promise of a lucrative employment opportunity and the chance to travel the world. He would successfully lure in an unknown number of women who were hoping and waiting for a better life. Everything about this man was a facade. If you look at his pictures as a young man, you can see the blossoming psychopath inside. Born in Cicero, Illinois in 1943, John Edward Robinson was brought up in a working-class neighborhood. He was not privileged by any means, but he and his family were not suffering. When he was 14 years old, he traveled to London with his Eagle Scout troop to sing for the Queen of England at the Palladium Theatre. There, he ran into Judy Garland, who, for those of you who are not familiar with this name, this is the woman who starred as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, and who was the mother of the very famous singer Liza Minnelli. Needless to say, this would have been a star-struck moment for the young boy, and photographers captured her kissing him on the cheek. At the time, the picture went viral across the newspapers in the country. John Edward Robinson had had his first taste of female attention, and the brewing little narcissist inside of him wanted more. In 1964, John Edward Robinson married Nancy Jo Lynch when he was 21. He worked at a Chicago hospital for a while, but he never finished any official training. He then set off on the world of becoming an entrepreneur, which is when his long list of lies, deception, and fraud really began. He was first arrested for embezzlement in 1969, for which he received 3 years probation. Then in 1970, he violated his probation by relocating back to Chicago without permission. There he became an insurance salesman at R.B. Jones Company, but only a year later, he was arrested again for embezzlement from his employer. For this offense, his probation was extended and then further extended in 1975 when he was arrested on securities and mail fraud in connection with his medical consulting company, which was a complete scam. John Robinson finally was given jail time for similar charges of embezzlement and check forgery in 1982. He served 60 days, but nothing would change his behavior. Upon his release from jail, he created yet another bogus medical company and even manipulated his friend into investing $25,000, even though his wife was dying and desperately needed expensive medical care. John Edward Robinson was such a delusional narcissist that he told people about how he was awarded Man of the Year in 1977, Kansas City. A huge banquet was held to honor him and all of his admirable work. It was later learned that he had made up both the award and the ceremony. There was nothing about his activities, known relationships, or other dealings that led people to suspect that he could be one of the most calculated and cold-blooded serial killers in the country. John Robinson was actively involved in coaching all 4 of his children's sports teams. He taught the little ones as a Sunday school teacher and volunteered as a scoutmaster. No one ever suspected him of being a sex-craved narcissistic psychopath. John Edward Robinson had crafted himself into the perfect serial killer, except his narcissism would eventually bring him down. As defined in the DSM-5, which is the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, narcissistic personality disorder is defined as comprising a pervasive pattern of grandiosity and fantasy or behavior, a constant need for admiration, and a lack of empathy, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts, as indicated by the presence of at least 5 of the following 9 criteria. Let us see how many of these John Edward Robinson ticks off. Number 1, a grandiose sense of self-importance. Check. Number 2, a preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. Check. Number 3, a belief that he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by or should associate with other special or high-status people or institutions. This one is a yes and no to me. He obviously believed he was extremely desirable and the only one to help and please many of his victims. But he didn't necessarily associate with people of a high status. Then again, part of his facade was that he was such a successful businessman that he needed someone to travel around the world with him, which was obviously a fantasy for him, so this coincides with number 2. Number 4, a need for excessive admiration, check. Number 5, a sense of entitlement. He was so entitled that he believed he could use women to his discretion and then dispose of them like they meant nothing to anyone. Check. Number 6, interpersonally exploitative behavior. Now, nothing could be more true for him than this trait, which describes someone who takes advantage of others for their own gain or to achieve their own ends. Check. Number 7, a lack of empathy. Check. Number 8, envy of others or a belief that others are envious of him or her. Check. Number 9, a demonstration of arrogant and haughty behaviors or attitudes. Check. So based on these clinical traits of a narcissist, John Edward Robinson is the poster child for this diagnosis. There are 2 distinct kinds of narcissism, one that is grandiose and one that is called vulnerable narcissism. This type of narcissism tends to be triggered by childhood neglect and abuse. These kinds of narcissists are usually much more sensitive than the other kind. Those with grandiose narcissism are aggressive, dominating, and exaggerate their importance. That John Edward Robinson is clearly the latter further negates his alleged claims of severe childhood neglect and abuse. Studies on both grandiose narcissism and psychopathy have shown a strong correlation between the two. That is not to say that vulnerable narcissists can't also be psychopaths, but they are likely to operate in ways much different than a psychopath who is grandiose. What is even crazier to me and interesting is how his modus operandi was much more similar to female serial killers than male. Whereas male serial killers tend to hunt and prey upon strangers, female serial killers lure in and trap their victims. Yes, John Edward Robinson's victims were all strangers initially, but he created what they believed was a genuine connection. He manipulated and charmed them into coming to him so that he could ultimately exploit and murder them. I also find it interesting how his murders almost overlapped with one another or were within the same year or two. It is difficult to deny that he was a very organized, if not a highly intelligent person when it came to his games with people, in particular women. The time and energy it took him to lure these women in, lead them on, trap them in his web, exploit them, kill them, dispose of the bodies, and then create an elaborate correspondence campaign with their loved ones so his crimes could not be exposed is really quite astounding. The depths of depravity and the lengths he went to take advantage of these women's vulnerability was not just disgusting, but it was beyond any comprehension. Some may describe him as a comfort serial killer or gain killer, but I don't think he fits into one mold or serial killer typology, which made him especially dangerous. None of these women had a great amount of money or anything that could advance him in any significant way. This leads me to believe that he did it all for the love of the con. That was what made him tick. For John Edward Robinson, it was all about the long game. For the most part, John Edward Robinson employed the exact same modus operandi to seduce these women into believing he wanted to give them a good life. Of the women who were proven to have been trapped and killed by him, he didn't stray far from his script, and why would he, when he was so successful at pulling them in to his sick little game? If it weren't for one of the mothers of his victims listening to her instincts that something was off and that her daughter may be missing and is in danger, who knows how many other vulnerable women he would have trapped and killed. I will never understand this man's appeal on any level to women, and how he successfully lured in an unknown number of women who seemingly disappeared. He was a truly depraved man who, by all evidence, truly enjoyed the power he placed over not just his victims, but their loved ones too. John Edward Robinson craved to confuse and torture them, which he effectively did with his letters and emails claiming that their daughters and sisters were fine. There is a scary level of darkness when someone enjoys inflicting that kind of mental anguish upon the innocent. As Heather Tiffany Robinson described him, and I quote, "It's like walking down a dark alley in the middle of the night, while you know someone is behind you, approaching you closer and closer." Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I am beyond thrilled to be your host. Until next time, stay safe and watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original song Stranger, composed by Stereocode.